Good morning and welcome everyone to this session. In this session about insurance products, we will try to focus on marine and aviation products. We will try to give you an insight into marine and aviation insurance products and how the IPT applies to these insurance products. I will be presenting this session with my colleague Emma Stephen, who is a Senior Client Technician at FiscalReps. So first of all, let me run through the agenda. In our session, we will try to focus on certain points and we will split the session into 4 or 5 main points. The first point will be quiz questions. So those will be like warm-up questions before we start looking into marine and aviation insurance in more detail. The second part will be actually the presentation about marine insurance itself. And the third part will be focused on aviation insurance. That will be presented by my colleague Emma. Finally, we will look into comparison of IPT rates between marine and aviation business, and hopefully we will have some time for questions and answers at the end. So you should have like paddleboards or papers with answers A or B. So let's try to be interactive and I'll ask you the first question. So what do you think, which insurance class number covers marine hull insurance? Is it A, class 6, or B, class 7? Feel free to guess. I see a lot of A's, yeah? So that is the correct answer. According to the Annex A of the first Non-Life Insurance Directive, class 6 covers indeed the marine hull insurance. As you are probably aware, marine hull covers damage to or loss of ships. What is actually the ship, or what is the definition of a ship? We will come on to that later. Question?
Sorry.
Yes,
the next question. Which insurance class number covers aviation hull risks? Again, use of paddleboards.
So A or B? A, class 3, B, class 5.
Yes, it is class 5.
Good. So that's the correct answer. Class 5 covers, again, according to the Annex A of the first Non-Life Insurance Directive, aviation hull insurance, which is damage to or loss of aircraft. The next question is more complicated, but I'm sure it's easy for you. Which combination of insurance classes would not cover marine risks? So which does not cover marine risks? Is it classes 5 and 11 or classes 6 and 12? I see a lot of A's, that's a good sign, yes. So when we are looking into classes 5 and 11, we are talking about aircraft insurance. Specifically in class 5, it's aircraft hull insurance, so damage to or loss of aircraft. If we are covering class 11, that's basically aircraft liability. So the correct answer was A.
Next question. Who remits the premium tax generally? Is it A, the insurance company, or B, the policyholder? Yes. Generally speaking, it is A, the insurance company.
Yes, that is the correct answer. In general, yes, it is the insurance company who is seen as a tax payment debtor. However, in practice, you can come across certain countries where the taxpayer would be the policyholder, specifically in Switzerland, which means that if there was a policy written by non-Swiss insurance company and there was a Swiss policyholder, the Swiss policyholder would be liable for the payment of Swiss stamp duty. Finally, the most important question of this session: who won the 2014 World Championship in football? Was it A, Brazil, B, Germany? That was a very difficult question. Yeah, it was Germany. They, just out of interest, the match between Brazil and Germany, and very interestingly, they had, I think, 8 shots on target, and they shot 7 goals, and Germany won 7-1. So that was a good result for me because I was supporting Germany at that time. Ooh. Right. Okay. So let's start with the presentation about marine insurance. So in this part about marine insurance, we will look into the definition of marine. We will try to determine location of risk as a key factor when talking about IPT rates applied to marine. We will look into difference between domestic and international, and then treatment between commercial and private insurance related to marine products. Then we will cover off some scenarios where double taxation can occur, and obviously we will speak about exemptions. Lastly, we will compare IPT rates between various countries in Europe. So, maybe question for you, what do you see, how would you define a ship? Well, okay, I'll answer the question for you. I don't think there's a specific or strict definition of a ship. In general, if we are following European directives, Annex A of the first non-life insurance directive again covers a short definition of ship as a sea, lake, canal or river vessel. So that means in practice anything that can swim on a sea or a lake or a river could be treated as a ship. This is very general definition, and in practice, as you know, IPT is a national tax, so national legislation can describe a vessel in their legislation in a different way. It could be very specific, could be very generic definition, but again, we need to look into national legislation to define what is covered under marine insurance. Generally speaking, again, in terms of European directive, if we are talking about marine insurance, marine hull, it covers damage to or loss of river or canal vessels, so the definition of the ship is covered under class 6. So what could we cover under marine insurance in general? It could be classes like class 6, that's a marine hull insurance, classes 7, that's goods in transit. Basically, goods in transit would be transported by way of sea in this case. Could be class 12, that's marine liability, which basically covers risks of the carrier or of the operator of a ship. Or it could be a combination of these products or combination of different products, like, for example, marine hull plus legal expenses, or goods in transit plus accident coverage. And in such case, we would be looking into apportioning premium and then applying the location of risk and IPT rates in practice. So first of all, when the insurance company writes insurance, in order to determine the correct IPT rate, there are certain steps to be taken. The first step would be the identification of the location of risk. After that, the insurance company needs to identify what class of insurance is written, and then hopefully this will help insurance company to identify the IPT rate or exemption. So the location of risk depends on 3 key factors. In terms of marine insurance, it could depend on the country of the registration. Maybe I should tell you about location of risk rules in general. As you are probably aware, the second Article 2D of the second non-life insurance directive identifies the member state where the location of risk can occur. In general, there are 4 intents. The first one covers off the property insurance, and in such case, when we are talking about property insurance, the location of risk should be in the member state of European Union in which the property is situated. In this case, we should be following the second intent of the Article 2D of the second non-life insurance directive, which means that the member state where the vehicle is registered, that member state should be the location of risk. So in case of vessels, if the vessel is registered in a certain country, and if you are looking at a marine hull insurance, that member state should be the location of risk where the ship is registered. Generally speaking, there could be some exemptions, which we will cover later. The third intent of the second non-life insurance directive covers insurance of travel or holiday risks with a duration of less than 4 months. So in such case, it would be the member state, the location of risk would be the member state where the policy has been taken out. Finally, the fourth intent covers off all other insurance types where we are looking at the place of habitual residence of the policyholder or permanent establishment of the policyholder. That relates to all products which have not been covered in those 3 previous intents. So, going back to marine insurance, the location of risk, as we said, could be triggered by country of the registration. So, for example, if the ship is registered in UK, the location risk would be in UK. The other criteria could be place of ship's operation. Now, that doesn't apply very often in practice, but again, we need to look into local legislation to be sure which location risk should be applied, but in practice this could happen, for example, in Germany, where under certain circumstances the ship needs to be registered in the German ships or vessel register, and in such case the German location risk would be triggered. Finally, we could be talking about establishment of the policyholder. This would relate mainly to classes 7, goods in transit, or carrier's liability, for example. We will try to look into these 3 points in more details later. What is important to note is that there is a difference between the treatment of marine insurance when it comes to domestic insurance and international, especially in terms of goods in transit. In practice, if goods are transported within the same country, the national IPT applies. However, if it's an international goods in transit, so let's say there's a marine cargo policy, for example in Bulgaria, the legislation specifically says if the goods are transported abroad, these policies are not subject to Bulgarian IPT. So certain countries specifically say that IPT doesn't apply, or these policies are exempt from IPT in those countries like Bulgaria, Germany or Austria, for example. Another distinction between marine insurance could be made between commercial policies or commercial risks and policies covering private insurance, private marine insurance. Generally speaking, again, if it was commercial policy, it would be exempt. If it was a private policy, it would be subject to IPT. A good example would be, for example, IPT application in Belgium, where we cover marine insurance of commercial vessels. Under certain circumstances, the policy would be exempt from IPT. However, if the same policy applied to private usage of the ship, in that case, IPT would apply. So let's run through certain scenarios to give you an idea what IPT should be applied, and in these two scenarios we will be able to see that some countries do apply IPT. However, under certain circumstances, the same insurance policy could attract two different premium taxes in two different countries. So, example, let's say there's an insurance policy which covers damage to or loss of ship. So it is class 6. This ship is used for non-commercial purposes and is registered in UK, but operates between UK and Germany. So the question to you is now, what IPT rate should be applied and why? So to answer this question, as we said, Article 2D of the Second Law Life Insurance defines membership or member state in which the location risk lies. So in this case, we would follow the second intent of the Article 2D, which is the member state of the registration of the vehicle. In this case, it would be UK. So definitely UK IPT does apply in this case. And what is important to say is that this ship is used for non-commercial purposes, and in UK, if the ship is used for non-commercial purposes, it will be subject to 6% IPT. The second potential locational risk would be Germany. And as I did mention before, in Germany, if the ship operates in German waters, it may be required under certain circumstances to be entered into a German vessel register, and in such case, it should receive a German flag. So actually German waters would be seen as a secondary port. So in that case, this policy could attract German IPT rate of 19%. So we can see that easily such non-commercial ship policy could attract two different rates, and the effective IPT rate would be quite high, 25%. So this is very important for the insurance company. Before the IPT is invoiced to the policyholder, these insurance companies must identify the locational risk and then the correct IPT rate. Let's take the same scenario and let's assume that this insurance policy covers exactly the same ship which is registered in UK, operates between UK and Germany, so Germany is again the secondary port, but this ship is registered only for commercial purposes, so it's not used for non-commercial purposes. If that was the case, you can see the difference. In UK, this insurance would be exempt, IPT exempt, and in Germany, IPT rate still applies, however, it is a lower rate of 3% IPT. The reason for that is the German legislation specifically says that if the vessel meets certain criteria, which is that ship is entered into the vessel registered in Germany, it is used for commercial purposes and it is covered for damage or loss leading from usage by on the sea. In that case, the German Article 3% should apply. So the effective rate at the end of the day for this policy would be 3%, which is less than in the first scenario. Obviously, there are certain countries which do not apply any IPT to marine policies or goods in transit by way of the sea. Such example would be, I don't know, for example, Denmark is a very good example where marine aviation and transport in general is exempt from insurance premium tax. So that should cover off the marine insurance in general, these two scenarios. Now we will look into IPT rates across certain European countries. As you can see from this slide, IPT rates across Europe are different. This is basically just proving that IPT is not a harmonized tax. IPT applies in different countries in different ways. Just for example, we can pick up the highest IPT rate, and this is the general IPT rate applied to Class 6 marine hull. The highest IPT rate from this slide would be Finnish IPT rate of 24%. Quite a high IPT rate can be seen in the Netherlands, that's 21%. Certain countries, as we did mention, Bulgaria, they could be attracting exemptions, these marine insurance policies. For example, in Malta, that's a tricky one, which we will cover off in aviation. There could be different scenarios again, but in general you can see that there's a variety of IPT rates applied across Europe.
So I don't understand France there. I thought France was 7 and 9%.
France, this is marine hull class 6. So in France, if it was marine hull insurance, it should attract 19%. Yes. Yeah, so that should be in terms of marine insurance. Do you have any questions in terms of marine insurance, or shall we cover them later? Okay, so now I'll hand over to Emma, and she will cover aviation insurance.
Okay, so we're going to follow the same format that Ladislav has pretty much gone through with the marine. So, providing a definition of what aviation insurance is. Well, generally we are talking about aircraft, and the Oxford Dictionary provides definition of aeroplane, helicopter, or other machine capable of flight. The next question that we would have would be, what class does a business fall underneath aviation insurance? So we're looking at Class 5, aviation hull, damage to or loss of the aircraft. Class 7, goods in transit, damage to the loss of goods in transit. Class 11, aviation liability, which is the insurance of the liability associated with the operation of the plane. And then, like Ladislav said, combination of products is also very common. Additionally, as mentioned, location of risk is significant to identify what IPT rates would be applicable. The local legislation is very important and does differ in many different territories, so it's key to look into that side of things alongside what it is actually being insured. So, when determining the location of risk, we should consider the country of registration. Commonly this is applicable to Class 5 aviation hull and Class 11 aviation liability. We also need to consider the place of the aircraft's operation. And finally, the establishment of the policyholder, and again this is usually applicable to Class 7 goods in transit. It's also worthwhile mentioning that if a policy is in storage whilst being transported, for a certain amount of time, depending on the local legislation, it can then be considered as Class 9 other damage to property, which would then attract a different IPT rate, or potentially attract a different IPT rate, and that's just another element to consider. Then we've also got the domestic versus international, commercial versus private elements to consider. Generally speaking, reiterating what Ladislav said, is that international commercial policies do generally tend to attract exemptions. However, there are some situations, such as in Hungary, where that does not apply. And so now we're going to run through a couple of scenarios that highlight quite nicely a sort of domestic versus international, commercial versus private element. So, insurance covering damage to or loss of a private aircraft carrying goods or people that is registered in Belgium. In this scenario, as we are looking at private insurance, we would be looking at a 9.25% IPT rate. However, when addressing scenario 2, where you have insurance covering damage to or loss of an aircraft used for commercial international passenger transport that is registered in Belgium, we then have it's exempt from IPT. And then finally, for scenario 3, we have insurance covering damage to or loss of an aircraft used solely for commercial purposes that is registered in the UK. Due to the commercial purposes that it's used for, the UK IPT would not be applicable. Would you like to speak about the example?
Yeah, so, for example, in terms of double taxation or risks of double taxation, we would be looking into certain scenarios where potentially, again, in terms of aviation insurance, we could be looking into 2 different IPT rates, possibly into double taxation. A good example would be, for example, in Malta, when we were looking into Maltese stamp duty legislation. Actually, the Maltese stamp duty legislation doesn't define aircraft or ship under vehicle. Basically, vehicles are identified as a land vehicle only. So when it came to aviation hull insurance, for example, potentially this insurance wouldn't be treated under registration plate of the aircraft or registration of the aircraft, but it could trigger in Malta, it could trigger Maltese stamp duty in case if the plane was registered, let's say, abroad, but it was owned by the policyholder located or with an establishment in Malta. So there is a specific scenario under those circumstances where you could apply different IPT rate or different stamp duty, which is not related to the registration plate of the vehicle, or under these circumstances not related to the registration of the aircraft. Another example could be Switzerland and Swiss stamp duty, where if the Swiss policy was subject to stamp duty, the Swiss tax authorities do not look into the location of risk rules in general, they look into location of the policy holder. So in example where, let's say, there's a aircraft insured for aircraft hull risks, but the policyholder is in Switzerland and the aircraft is registered in the UK, for example. Under certain circumstances, if that aircraft insurance is not exempt, it could be subject to Swiss stamp duty. If it was the same aircraft used for, for example, for commercial purposes and the takeoff weight would be over a certain limit, I think it's 5.7 tons. In such case, it would be exempt from Swiss stamp duty. So that could be an example where you could see different treatment of the same policy. Obviously there are some exemptions and they usually copy the marine exemptions, like in Bulgaria we've seen exemptions applied to marine and aviation. Similarly in Denmark, the whole range of marine aviation and transport policies are exempt from tax on non-life insurance.
And then on our final slide, we have a comparison of the sort of general Class 5 aviation hull for commercial insurance with IPT rates that would be applicable. As you can see, they are quite similar to that of the marine hull. And again, it's reiterating what Ladislav said in the sense of Finland's quite high, Netherlands quite high, and a few exemptions.
Thank you, Emma. So at this slide, we would like to show you the comparison of IPT rates applied, and again, we are looking into marine hull, aviation hull classes 5 and 6. So as you can see from this slide, in general, IPT rates are the same. I would like to point out at one exemption, and that is France. Yes, that is France, where you can see that marine hull should attract 19% IPT. However, if it was aviation hull policy in the same country, it is exempt from IPT. Again, we will need to look into certain policy documentation to identify the exact IPT rates, but these are general IPT rates applied across certain European countries. In certain countries, as we did mention, the IPT rate may depend on whether the insurance covers commercial or private usage of the ship or the aircraft, or the IPT rate could depend on the sum insured, like in Cyprus, could depend whether the ship or the aircraft is used abroad, especially in goods in transit policies. So that would be in terms of IPT rates and the comparison of these IPT rates. Do you have any questions to be discussed? If not, I could run through some grey areas in terms of marine aviation and transport policies, and maybe I could draw some examples if you would like.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Marine, where you've got a stop group of policy, so at some point the risk transfers from actually being marine to being property.
Right, yes.
How do you
You will
apply
need to...
the appropriate tax? You take everything that's in storage as being the value that you calculate your premium from, or do you ask the client to say how much has been in storage in excess of 40 days or
Yes.
something like that?
That's a very good question, and there are certain discussions about the treatment of goods in storage. But in general, you will need to look into the local legislation to identify what are the conditions to be met. Very good example would be, for example, I think Belgium is a very good example, where if you had a goods in transit policy, in general it would attract 1.4% IPT. However, if there was the same policy, and as you said, if the policy covered goods in transit and these goods are then stored in certain place, and there's a storage of these goods, a higher rate could be applied, especially if it was containers insurance. So in such case, it would be treated as a property policy and taxed at 9.25%. And in addition to IPT, if the goods are stored for more than 48 hours, you would apply INAMI of 6.56%, and under these circumstances, you would apply 10% of 6.5% INAMI rate. So there are very specific scenarios. Another case could be, or another example could be in France, where generally speaking, if goods are stored, if goods are stored in a certain place for more than 60 days, they would be treated as a property policy. So you would not apply only IPT, but you would apply also MRPF taxes or levies and other fiscal charges. But that is a very good question, because not all insurance companies treat goods in transit in a correct way, in a compliant way. And if, like, tax authorities look into these policies, they identify that there's certain element covering storage of goods. In such case, the taxation rule or taxation would be different of these premiums. Prudent approach would be to split the premium, so there will be a premium split between goods in transit risks and storage risks, and then IPT will be applied accordingly. But again, this depends on countries where they distinguish between goods in storage and goods in transit. Yes?
You mentioned like France, aviation hull is exempt. I can't remember the class of the insurance, but I've seen it in Spain as well, that they are exempt.
Aviation hull in Spain.
Aviation hull, yeah.
It is possible to confirm this information. I will need to look into the legislation, but it is possible that in Spain the aviation would be exempt. Certain countries do treat aviation, marine and transport insurance as exempt in general. If there are certain criteria met, certain conditions met, these policies could be subject to IPT. But in Spain, I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't want to give you misleading information, so I will need to double check. If you would like, I can then get in touch with you later and we can talk about this treatment. When we are talking about goods in transit, that was a very good question. I would like to draw an example where goods in transit could be treated as exempt. And that would be especially in countries where legislation specifically says that goods in transit policies are exempt if they relate to coverage of international goods in transit. Now, such countries where this is specifically mentioned in legislation are Bulgaria, Germany and Austria. Other countries do not or may not distinguish between domestic and international goods in transit. So countries like, as Emma said, Hungary could tax an insurance policy even if it covers international goods in transit. What is important to identify in these cases is the location of risk. As we did cover in a couple of first slides, the location risk would be triggered in this specific case of goods in transit policies by the permanent establishment of the policyholder or the habitual residence if it was an individual. So let's say in the scenario where there's a Bulgarian policyholder, that Bulgarian policyholder would like to take out a policy which covers goods in transit transported from Bulgaria to Slovenia, for example. In that scenario, we will be sure that the location risk is in Bulgaria. However, as these goods are transported abroad, it falls under international goods in transit and it will be treated as exempt from IPT. We could take the same scenario in Germany, for example. Let's say there's a German policyholder who takes out an insurance policy to cover goods in transport. But let's take a scenario where goods are transported from Germany to France. Yes, it will be international goods in transit and it will be exempt from IPT. However, if there was the same scenario, the same policy, let's say goods are transported from Germany to France, then going to Germany, south of Germany, for example, again, this will not be treated as international goods in transit because the starting point and the end point or delivery point will be the same country, Germany. So German IPT in that scenario will apply to goods in transit policy. Another typical scenario where insurance companies are not very confident about location risk and IPT applies to marine and aviation policies, especially related to goods in transit, are carriers' liability policies. So let's say if the policyholder would like to take out the policy to cover his liability while he carries goods by way of the sea or aviation. Now I would like to ask you a question. What do you think, where would be the location risk on what factor it depends? Where's the location risk in terms of carriers' liability insurance? So if we go through those points again, so country of the registration of the, let's say, ship or the aircraft, it doesn't really matter because you are not covering the damage to the aircraft or the ship, you are covering the liability of the carrier. So it's not the first option. Place of ship's operation, not really, that's not very important. The establishment of the policyholder, yes, that would be considered in this case because if you are insuring the liability, carrier's liability of the carrier, we would be looking into his or her establishment in the country. So a scenario where, let's say there's an Austrian policyholder and this policyholder in Austria takes out the policy to cover his liability while he carries goods either in Austria or abroad, we would be insuring Austrian risk. So if the Austrian policyholder covers his liability in Austria, it will be taxable, it will be subject to Austrian IPT. However, if we were covering the same carrier, his liability, and these goods were transported abroad, this will be treated as international carrier's liability, and in certain countries like Austria, Germany, this is specifically mentioned in the legislation that this would be exempt from IPT. So again, you can see that is a very important factor to identify location risk before the IPT rate is applied, because yes, you can cover carrier's liability, but what is actually the location of risk and what IPT should apply? Those are very important questions to be answered. One grey area in general, which we covered briefly before, was Malta and Maltese legislation. As we did mention, in Malta, the standard legislation doesn't specifically says what is covered under vehicle. They generally understand that vehicle is only the land vehicle, so motor insurance falls under vehicle insurance in Malta. However, certain countries like UK, they specifically say that vehicles of any type cover land vehicles, ships and aircraft. So that can be given as an example that in some countries there's a grey area to identify the location risk. However, in some countries like the UK, it is clearly defined and insurance companies should be confident in identifying the location of risk and the IPT rate applied to class of insurance. One last point I've noted here on my notes is that when it comes to aviation liability insurance, we could be looking into other criteria, important criteria, like its if it's, let's say, aviation liability insurance in Switzerland, we would be looking into whether this aircraft is used for commercial or private purposes, and what is the takeoff weight. So, for example, if the aircraft in Switzerland was used usually for commercial purposes, and it could deliver or carry goods or people, but takeoff weight would be over 5.7 tons, and it operates over 9 months abroad, then in such case it would be treated as exempt. Similarly, the marine aviation policy would be treated in Switzerland as well. In UK, again, we are looking at the takeoff weight of the plane if it's an aircraft liability insurance, and in such case where the aircraft is over, the takeoff weight of the aircraft is over 8 tons, it could be treated as exempt from IPT. Again, we need to look into more details to identify certain criteria, but this is generally speaking where the takeoff weight is taken into consideration to identify the exemption applied. Any questions from your side? No? Okay. I think we have approximately 5 to 7 minutes left. Feel free to ask any questions if you would like. Otherwise, I think we could maybe end the session if you like. Shall we go through some examples if you would like, or maybe I can give you examples where, let's say, there's no distinction made between goods in transit, domestic and international. Such countries are like, for example, Hungary. The legislation doesn't really say whether goods in transit in Hungary are exempt. It applies, basically Hungarian tax authority apply Hungarian IPT to goods in transit. What is interesting to note is, for example, in terms of carrier's liability in Hungary, you would be looking into the default IPT rate of 10%. Now, this default IPT rate can be lower depending on the value of the premiums written within the previous calendar year. If we were talking about casco insurance, so damage to or loss of the aircraft or ship, the IPT rate would be higher, so that would be 15%, the default rate. I think that could be seen in the last slide where we compared these rates. So in this case we were comparing marine aviation hull, and in Hungary, as you can see, the default rate was 15%. However, if it was aircraft liability, the IPT rate would be lower. So it's not always that the aircraft liability and aircraft hull and marine liability and marine hull attract the same insurance premium tax rates. If you don't have any questions, I would like to thank you for your attention, and hopefully I'll see you later to catch up with drinks. If you would like to meet up later, maybe in one-to-one meetings, then feel free to grab me and we can discuss any questions you like. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.